Welcome back. We're off and running now on Lecture 15. This will take us 3/4 of the way through the series in Part 1. In terms of your workbook information, you should by now have had enough information to answer all the questions through Unit 6, the migrations of Israel by name, and we've covered the information bringing us up through the first 6 of those workbook questions. We'll fill in starting with question number 7 as we get into the material today. Now, last time we drew closure with some quotations from John Hulley's little article, Did Any of the Lost Tribes Go North? In that same vein, I want to, primarily just to make you acquainted with, and I guess I should put a disclaimer of sorts here in, as is the case with any human product, you're going to find various imperfections. And when I make reference to these various articles, please do keep in mind that I'm not necessarily endorsing everything that's in them. But what I want to do in terms of the overall video lecture series is I want each student to leave with a very good sense of bibliography of where they might go to pursue other lines of inquiry. In some respects, this is often the case with any survey-style course, what we have here really is a point of departure more than the last say or the last word. I should as well make also mention of the fact that the information that I'm giving to you here is my understanding based on the date today, which happens to be in early September of 1997. As new information comes to light or other developments may occur, I certainly want to reserve the right, as you should yourself, to make adjustments in terms of your own outlook and opinion on some of these things. Picking up with some of the references, then one that I would like to draw your attention to is a little circular by a man whose name is W.E. Filmer. He wrote a little essay called Our Scythian Ancestors. I've mentioned Filmer's work in previous lecture sessions, but specifically what I want to just draw your attention to is that where Hulley proposed a migration of some of the Israelite tribespeople, which would have gone down to the east and then up and through the Bosphorus on into Europe. Filmer argues a different route, not that they're competing, mind you, because as I've already suggested in the last lecture, chances are good that the Israelites were dispersed widely and they moved independent of one another in different pockets and among groups of larger people, very much in the spirit of Amos's prophecy about being sifted like corn would be sifted, and yet God knowing the whereabouts of the people all along that way. Filmer's proposal is that they would have gone rather in a more westerly direction initially, passing through the Dariel Pass and on into the region of the Caucasus mountain range. His proof, which I think is somewhat suspect, as later research has shown, but again, there may be some elements of the truth there still at work. There's a network of Scythian tombs dating from around the early 6th century BC in that part of the world. It extends, as best we can date it archaeologically, up until around the mid-4th century BC. And it exists to the northwest of the area and documents the course which the Israelites may well have taken. He bases his evidence principally on certain similarities in burial practices that you find among the Germanic populations that arrived in the regions of northwestern Europe, the Baltic Sea area and the southern part of the Baltic Sea several centuries later, in his attempt to connect this Israelite/Scythian group together in one form or another. His argument is interesting, and while it falls a bit short, I think, in making an indisputable, an unchallengeable connection between the Israelites and the Scythians, it gives a good sense of ways in which people have approached the argument and tackled it. A more reliable piece of evidence in the one booklet that we've worked from, which I think I don't have here handy at the moment, but it's the America and Britain in Prophecy publication by Raymond F. McNair. There's a text box, an inset, on page 42 of his book called Hard Physical Evidence, which gives a good example of ways in which people have tried to make this connection. Now, a last individual, and this is a kind of a classic vintage old British Israelite work. It's done by an old retired military man, a Major Bertram Weldon. He wrote a volume called Origins of the English. Like many British Israelite authors who came out of the British military tradition, the imperial military tradition, he draws upon his intuition, his sense of military tactics and strategy, and he makes certain deductions. He brings his military experience to bear on the issue of how the Israelites might have made their escape from their land of deportation and where they might have gone. He would frame it a little bit stronger, I think, than what I'm putting it here. But he equates the freeing of the Israelites with the Assyrian defeat at the hands of a Babylonian king, Nabopolassar, and the series of engagements, initially the fall of Nineveh that we spoke about in 612, the first battle of Carchemish in 609 or 608, somewhere there in that time frame, and then the final knockout blow, which came in 605, when at Carchemish the last remaining Assyrian stronghold was extinguished, was crushed. Weldon examines and draws from what records we have of those events to make certain deductions, and he puts it together, again, drawing from some of the apocryphal works, specifically the book of Tobit, a work which probably was written somewhere between 250 and 175 BC. Weldon suggests that Tobit was a leader in both the Israelite community, and he was also an Assyrian official, a representative of the Assyrian government. He argued that, Tobit that is, argued that a return to Palestine, the old homeland, would be impractical. Hostile armies, and as you get to the close of the 7th century, there was a lot of military activity in that general region of the Fertile Crescent, and he figured that a return back home would not be possible, that an Egyptian garrison had occupied Judah and the route was blocked, and so on and so forth. And he goes on to write these words, which I find compelling. Was it the way that it happened? I don't know. Could it have been? I think certainly it could have. Between the country of the Carducci and the armies of the Medes, a narrow gap lay open. This was the route through the Caucasus. With some dim traditions of their former exodus to hearten them, and we saw in the book of 2nd Esdras an oblique reference to that, and with encouragement given by more recent prophetic messages which Weldon argues had reached them allegedly from Jeremiah the prophet. The tribes left their starting point probably in the region of Ecbatana. They crossed the upper waters of the Euphrates, where their enemies very nearly cut them off, and here's where you have the kind of cross-reference to Esdras chapter 13. They then swung north through the Caucasus into Scythia. In the Caucasus, one of the important passes bears the name Gates of Israel to this day. The flight of Israel, which may be dated around 608 BC, the year of the Battle of Carchemish, that would bring the tribes across the upper Euphrates through the passes of the Caucasus to the vast barren plains of the Scythian steppe. It's a fascinating story, and it may well, like probably many of the theories that spring out of British Israel literature, be a version of the truth based on military strategic intuition, which fills in the gaps where some of the solid historical evidence that we would love to have just simply is not available. It's just not there. Now, let's turn then to the issue of the Volkswanderung, the movement of those Germanic tribespeople, which eventually spread through Central Europe and filtered all the way into the northwestern coastal regions and the British Isles. There were, it's a fairly safe deduction, there were waves of immigrants, migratory cycles. To go back to that old analogy which we've used in the lecture series before, almost like the sea coming in, going out, coming in, going out in different waves. To summarize without going into some of the intimate details, which I'll give you some references to works which you can on your own time explore and plumb the depths of at your leisure, there seems to have been a first wave including Israelitish people among those peoples in antiquity known as the Celts, or if you want to make it a more American pronunciation, the Celts, and the Cimmerians or Sumerians. That migration probably took place coming out of Assyria, going through the Caucasus mountain range, and on eventually bending back down and around into Western and Central Europe. The Greek name Celt derives, or the name Celt derives from the Greek word. If you want to trace these people through the history of antiquity, the Roman name for essentially the same ethnic stock of people would have been the Gauls. Julius Caesar even wrote a book about his wars in the area that was inhabited by the Gallic people. A later and second wave undoubtedly included a body of Israelites among a group of people that is fairly well known in history, and Mr. McNair's research is fairly extensive and well done in this area and places, and it has to do with the Scythian tribes people. That migration more than likely came around the Caspian Sea before it eventually turned west and passed through what is now southern Russia, going into northern Poland and parts of what is present-day Germany. More than likely, along the way, those Scythian peoples were pressed by what we would know as the Slavic peoples of today, the Eastern European Slavs. These migrations overspread much of northwestern Europe, spilling into also territories of Scandinavia, where you have oftentimes the fair-haired folks of that region of Denmark and Sweden today. The various names by which these people were very much known, or better known, I should say, would be the Normans, the Danes, the Swedes, the Franks, the Lombards, the Scots, the Angles, the Jutes, the Saxons, not to mention a host of other lesser-known names, which probably many of which have been lost altogether to us in the modern 20th century. Again, this is not to say that every Lombard, every Dane, every Norman, Swede, Frank, and so on was an Israelite by ethnic heritage. But among those groups, it seems undoubtedly that there were large representations, and maybe even the dominant block of the population, especially with the groups such as the Angles and the Saxons. There is other evidence of Israelite migration. This one actually goes back in time some degree. There is a tradition, or there are arguments, one of the best works, incidentally, in this connection, which traces and tries to document these movements, would be W. Howard Bennett's Symbols of Our Celto-Saxon Heritage. Bennett, if memory serves me, was a customs official for the government of Canada for many years. And this particular volume really does a wonderful job, not only in illustrations, but also in terms of capturing and elaborating on some of the traditions which are tied into these ideas and notions. One development that he does do quite well, I thought, was the immigration of the tribe of Dan, the Danite migrations. There's a tradition which indicates that some of the tribespeople of Dan began their immigration process as early as the 15th century BC in connection with the exodus out of Egypt, that instead of moving along with the larger body of Israelite tribespeople, they eventually found their way to Greece and ultimately became a part of that Celtic population which eventually settled over the long haul in Ireland. A caveat which I've hit on already several times: not all Celts, not all Scythians, not all Cimmerians were Israelites. That's not a formula that X equals Y in that respect. Indeed, Scythian is very probably more a generic term than it is a name for tribal peoples comprised of a unique and specific ethnic group. There may indeed even be a biblical backhanded allusion to this kind of Scythian connection. Let me turn with you to Colossians chapter 3. Let's look in chapter 3 and verse 11. There's a kind of juxtaposition here which we find in the phraseology, which may say something more than is immediately on the surface of this passage. Colossians 3, speaking about that which Christ has done for us, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond nor free, but Christ is all and in all. And of course, Paul's main point in this is that, and this gets back to some of the themes that I sounded in the inaugural lectures for part 1, that the physical, material dimensions of the Abrahamic promise pale in insignificance. They're dwarfed by the promise of spiritual salvation, that seed in whom all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And in Christ we begin to see the earnest fulfillment of that. But also in even the structure here, where it juxtaposes, places side by side Greek or non-Israelite along against Jew. Those who are circumcised, implying an Israelitish people, against those who are not. And then interestingly enough, barbarian placed alongside Scythian. There may have been an awareness on Paul's part that the Scythian peoples were indeed, at least in part, made up of Israelitish stock. You get the same kind of dynamic over in Galatians chapter 3, again another good book of the Bible, which very clearly reveals to us the supremacy of the spiritual dimensions of the Abrahamic promise. There is neither, verse 28 of Galatians chapter 3, neither Jew nor Greek, neither bond nor free, not even male or female, for you're all one in Jesus Christ. So that is an interesting sidelight, a detail, if you will. Now, there's been worthwhile work done by many different people in the area, and I'm going to pause for just a moment or two and draw to your attention some of what is out there and some of the resources that you might find interesting to draw upon. I think I showed you these in the opening rounds of the lectures. The first two books are volumes by Yair Davidi. This one is called The Tribes. It's his earlier work, and he does some really interesting spade work in terms of his research and his development on what his subtitle says, the Israelite origins of the Western people. Narrowing that to a more focused discussion on the identity of Ephraim, you find his volume here simply entitled Ephraim, and then the subtitle, The Tudor Rose Symbol of England. Stephen Collins, a member of the Church of God, has done a fairly well-known volume among the peoples in the churches of God entitled The Lost 10 Tribes of Israel Found. And in particular, well, let me just read to you some of the chapter titles. King David and Israel's Rise to Greatness. King Solomon and the Golden Age of Israel. Chapter 3, Israel, the Forgotten World Empire. Chapter 4, Israelite and Jewish migration, dealing with the subject that we're talking about here, from Palestine. And then in an area where Mr. Collins delves into some of the subjects which you don't find in all that many volumes in terms of British Israelite literature. Chapter 5, Carthage, the colony that became an empire. Chapter 6, the Scythian Sake, the Asian sons of Isaac. Chapter 7, Parthia, an Israelite empire rises in Asia. Chapter 8, Parthia, the forgotten ancient superpower. And then he goes on to, in a chapter about Jesus Christ's life and some of the ideas about where he was from his birth until his age 30, his ministry and death. Chapter 10, Israelite migrations from Asia after Parthia's fall. Chapter 11, the tribes of Israel in the modern world, and we'll get to that in terms of tribal identities a little later in today's lecture, or perhaps further down the line in some of the other lectures under the heading of Unit 6, the migrations of Israel. In connection with the Parthians, I think I made reference to Dr. Herman Hayes' article, Where Did the Original Apostles Go?, which was published in a Good News magazine, actually two in a series, in August of 1987, and again in the September-October number of the Good News in 1987 as well. It is noteworthy, that particular piece, for its connection of the Parthian people with the Israelites. Indeed, Parthian, the word or the name itself, means escaped slave. A member of the Church of God in Sydney, Australia, publishes a newsletter that I show you here. It's Origins of the Nations, and has a variety of material available on various research projects that have been done. Craig White is the man who organizes this. Even has a website, the address of which you can find in your selected bibliography. But all kinds of information available there as well. One volume which is somewhere in storage, I would share it or show it to you today, but you'll find it in the references. It's actually translated, I believe, out of the Swedish language, but Ann Christensen is the author. Her work, Who Were the Sumerians and Where Did They Come From? This is a scholarly treatise, one which brings in the notion that these people, the Sumerians, may indeed have had a genetic and a geographic origin coming out of the ancient Near East. Once again, the caveat that I've given in a number of cases as we've worked our way through here, these are all reference works. They are not perfect. They are not unflawed. Mentioning a book or citing it in the bibliography does not necessarily mean that I or you should necessarily endorse everything that's in the publication, or that any of these publications are necessarily of equal value. They do include information which can be helpful when viewed in balance and measured in a responsible way. Let's move then to a discussion of some of the myths and legends, some of the evidences, if you want to maybe strengthen that a bit, of connections that can be and have been made, or proposed at least, by people from the British Israelite community. The first that I want to take a look at, and a friend and former colleague of mine on the Ambassador University faculty brought this to my attention a while back, is the remarkable declaration of Aberbrothock. It springs out of Scotland. It's a declaration that was dated April the 6th in the year 1320. Scottish noblemen of the estates in Parliament gathered at the Abbey in Aberbrothock. They assembled. This was 3 years after the celebrated defeat of King Edward II, the King of England, when the Scottish army defeated the English at the Battle of Bannockburn. If you saw the Mel Gibson movie Braveheart, some of these kinds of themes and issues about the Anglo-Scottish difficulties and problems of the 13th and 14th centuries were very nicely captured, although I would say that Mr. Gibson played fast and loose with some of the history of the period. It nonetheless, in spirit, captured some of the important issues of the time. And one was the drive, and as you often find, by the way, in the Celtic peoples. A goodly portion of the southern southeastern, I should say, United States is populated by a Gaelic or a Celtic population. And that group is noted for its love of independence. Its stubborn insistence to do things as individuals in the way that they wish to do them. The Scottish people are a part of that ethnic group. And in this declaration, the Scottish aristocrats publicly endorsed the rulership of Robert the Bruce, again a figure who was played or characterized in the Mel Gibson movie Braveheart. It's an assertion of their independence. And in the context of that, is a remarkable statement, which I want to at least read a part of for you. Let's see if I can find quickly here in this little manuscript. Okay, there we go. But there is an offhanded, an oblique reference, which in a sense is an evidence of a kind of Scythian-Scottish connection. Within this declaration we read, "We know, most holy Father and Lord, from the chronicles and the books of the ancients gather, that among other illustrations or illustrious nations, ours, to wit the nation of the Scots, has been distinguished by many honors, which passing from the greater Scythia through the Mediterranean Sea and the Pillars of Hercules, and sojourning in Spain among the most savage tribes through a long course of time, could nowhere be subjugated by any people, however barbarous. And coming thence 1,200 years after the outgoing of the people of Israel, they, by many victories and infinite toil, acquired for themselves the possessions in the west which they now hold. In their kingdom 113 kings of their own royal stock, no stranger intervening, have reigned." And that's a remarkable, what shall we say, shred of evidence along the way, which can be taken and applied, as it often has been among British Israelites, as part of the body of evidence which makes more sure the connection of the Israelitish people with some of those who have immigrated into the British Isles. Now, to the west of Scotland, of course, is the island, an often troubled island of Ireland. Many are familiar with the heraldic symbol of Ulster, that province or that region where today you find the Northern Irish. The city of Belfast lies within its confines. And in terms of the symbol itself, and here the Bennett book on our symbols of our Celto-Saxon heritage, the Bennett book excels in its descriptions. Tied to a family known as O'Neill is a remarkable story about how Ulster came into the hands of the O'Neill family. According to the legend, there was a much celebrated boat race between the chieftains of the O'Neill clan and the MacDonald clan, and whoever reached the land first, the territory of Ulster first, whoever touched that region first, would become the prince of Ulster, would dominate, would determine the ownership of the region of Ulster. And as the boats approached the shoreline and were almost there, the boat piloted by the chieftain from the O'Neill family realized that he wasn't going to quite be able to beat his MacDonald adversary. So he took and cut off one of his hands, picked up the severed member, and hurled it onto shore. The hand landed there, thus giving him the claim to the Ulster region. Now, the symbol then of the red hand that you see on many of the flags and in the heraldry of the region of Ulster, that symbol sometimes has been suggested to connect to this whole discussion, where we'll get to in just a moment or two, of the throne of David. Those people who believe that David's throne and a representative off the reunited Pharez, Zerah lines or branches of Judah's family, there's an argument that the throne of David was planted in Ireland around the 6th century BC, and then through the 6th century AD, that throne stayed or remained in a region of Ireland known as Tara. Ireland is often connected, its red hand that is, to the account that we'll take a look at right now. It's a fairly short passage, and one reads it and in some ways wonders why it's included in the biblical record, and perhaps there's substance to this notion and this idea. Genesis chapter 38 records the birth of these two twin sons, Pharez and Zerah. When their mother went into labor, she began to travail. Verse 28 it says, And one of the children, the unborn males, extended his hand out of the womb. And the midwife, wanting to be sure that she knew which baby was born first, in other words, which received the right of primogeniture, the double portion of the birthright that would be passed on, she took and bound a scarlet thread around that child's hand, saying, "This came out first." Well, it came to pass that the hand was withdrawn back into the womb, and behold, his brother came out first. And she said, "How have you broken forth? This breach be upon you." Therefore his name was called Pharez, meaning in essence breach, or why have you made this breach against us, or you. Afterward came out his brother that had the scarlet thread upon his hand, and thus his name was called Zerah. And what various ones have suggested is that the Zerahite branch of the Jewish family, once the Davidic line of monarchs was established, and David, of course, traced his lineage back to the Pharez line, the one that ultimately came out first in spite of the extended hand out of the womb. Around the 10th century, when the Davidic monarchy was set up and established, Zerah, seeing that it had been thus deprived of its primogeniture, some or perhaps many of the Jews of that branch of the family took off seeking its fortunes in Europe. There are connections with the family of Zerah at various points along the way. The story about various cities in Greece and the legends of the Trojans and what have you are sometimes connected. One story would have us understand that Calcol, a grandson in this case of Zerah's, which would even predate the argument that the Davidic throne and its establishment precipitated the migration. One story holds, and Bennett I think develops this quite nicely, that Calcol, Zerah's grandson, led the family west into Spain, and eventually he wound up in Ulster, founding the kingdom there in the late 17th, well, the date is not the 17th century, it would have been the, I guess, the late 14th century or thereabouts. Does the scarlet thread forecast the heraldic red hand? I don't know, but it is an interesting curiosity in history. It's also worthy of noting that until the year 1920 AD, the red hand in that symbolism oftentimes was encircled by a red cord, and that was, until around 1920, the official arms of Northern Ireland. Now, moving on to the whole business or the issue relevant to the throne of David, because in most British Israelite literature, this theme of the perpetual throne of David plays a very central role. I want you to turn to Jeremiah 33 and verse 17. Jeremiah 33 and verse 17 makes a powerful and a startling statement. For thus says the Eternal, David shall never want for a man to sit upon the throne of the house of Israel. And this has been interpreted in various ways through time. Anyone who knows even casually the history of the British monarchy is well aware that there have been periods where there were people, where there was not a throne occupied by a reigning monarch. In the late 1640s, in the Civil War, which took place in England, Charles I, the monarch, was actually captured and ultimately beheaded. And there was a period of 11 to 12 years, an interregnum, or period between the reigns, a time when there was not a ruling monarch on the throne. But there was, in exile, in the comfortable refuge of his relative, who was the King of France. There was the young man Charles, who ultimately in 1660 would become Charles II, the King of England. Does this passage imply that there will be a Davidic monarch ruling over the house of Israel? In general terms, The story of the throne of David, or the notion that there's a surviving throne of David, can be sketched in this way. The throne indeed survived the Babylonian captivity, in spite of the fact that Zedekiah, all of his sons were executed before his eyes, and then he himself was blinded and carried away for the rest of his life, held captive by his Babylonian adversaries. The story of the perpetual throne of David would have us believe that Jeremiah transported the daughters, and there is biblical evidence that that was part of his responsibility and duty, that the daughters of the king remained with Jeremiah, and he took them with him first to Egypt, as the biblical account attests, but ultimately, and indeed, Jeremiah's story is one which disappears from both the biblical and historical record. We find him identified in various myth and legend and tradition. And those would have us to believe that ultimately Jeremiah migrated going through Spain and ultimately up to Ireland, where eventually one of those daughters of King Zedekiah, Tehaphnehes by name, married into a line of Jews who were descended from those Zerahite Jews who had left the Middle East around the 10th century BC, when the Pharez line gained preeminence with the ascension of King David. It was there that this representative of the Pharez branch, a daughter of Zedekiah, married a man, according to the annals of the Irish, whose name was Harriman, and that union healed this breach alluded to by Genesis chapter 39 and verse 29. Ultimately, the argument goes that that line moved to Scotland and then finally to England, where it is found still today, with the Davidic king sitting on the throne, ruling, as it were, in this case a queen, Elizabeth II, ruling as a representative of the House of Windsor over what amounts essentially to an Israelitish group of people. Now, there's biblical evidence for this idea, and I want us to take a look at some of the scriptures that oftentimes are used to illustrate and demonstrate and support this notion. The Bible suggests, in fact it fairly powerfully affirms, that a covenant, a perpetual covenant, was made with David, guaranteeing the longevity of his throne. We read in 2 Samuel chapter 7, the point at which God affirms that there will be for David an enduring dynasty. The word of the Eternal came to Nathan, saying, "Go and tell my servant David, when your days be fulfilled," this is in 2 Samuel 7 and verse 4, "and when you sleep with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you, which proceeds out of your bowels, and I will establish his kingdom, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." Now, the promise was not conditional based on the behavior of the heir to the throne. Verse 14 reveals that as well. "If he, the heir, commits iniquity, I'll chasten him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the children of men. But my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you, and your throne shall be established forever." Now, at one level, we could argue this is a reference to Christ who never sinned, but then in 2 Chronicles, we have to deal with the problem. Back in verse 14, we have to deal with the problem of this phrase, "if he shall commit iniquity." Okay, Christ did not sin, so this reference, it cannot be made to the Messiah, who came and was sin-free. 2 Chronicles 13:5. "Ought you not to know that the eternal God of Israel gave the kingdom over Israel to David forever, even to him and to his sons, by a covenant of salt, which in those days in antiquity was symbolic of permanence." Psalm 89 adds additional weight. "If his children forsake my law, if they walk not in my judgments, if they break my statutes and keep not my commandments," and most of them did not, "then I will visit their transgressions with the rod and their iniquity with stripes. Nevertheless, my loving kindness will I not utterly take from him, nor suffer my faithfulness to fail. My covenant will I not break, nor alter the thing that is gone out from my lips. Once I have sworn by my holiness that I will not lie unto David. His seed shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. It shall be established forever as the moon, and as a faithful witness in the heaven. So both sun and moon are tokens, much like the rainbow represents God's promise never to destroy the earth in the same way again. The sun and the moon are emblematic of the durability, of the longevity of that Davidic throne. In that regard, Jeremiah chapter 33 in verses 14 through 17, and we've already read verse 17, but let's read the preamble. Behold, the days come, says the Eternal, that I will perform that good thing which I promised unto the house of Israel and to the house of Judah. In those days, and at that time, will I cause a branch of righteousness to grow up unto David, and he shall execute judgment and righteousness in the land. In those days shall Judah be saved, and Jerusalem dwell safely. And this is the name wherewith she shall be called, the Lord our righteousness. For thus says the Eternal, David shall never want a man to sit upon the throne of the house of Israel. Indeed prophetic of the coming of Christ, but in a different respect and at a different level of interpretation, applying principles of duality, which we've discussed in the lecture series before, existing as well in various ways and forms in that time from David's up until the present day. Dropping down to, or moving back to 2 Kings chapter 11, beginning in verse 31. Shortly before Israel split into two separate kingdoms, a statement that was made by God to Jeroboam, who became the king of the northern monarchy. Behold, I will rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and I will give 10 tribes to you. But he shall have one tribe for my servant David's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, and the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes. Howbeit, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him prince all the days of his life, for David my servant's sake, whom I chose, because he kept my commandments and my statutes. But I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand, and I will give it to you, even 10 tribes. And unto his son I will give one tribe, that David my servant may have a light always before me in Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen to put my name there. Dropping down again to look at other references in the book of Luke, chapter 1 and verse 32. He shall be great, and he shall be called the Son of the Highest. The Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David, indicating that when Christ returns, that Davidic throne will indeed fall into the hands of Jesus Christ. Moving on and taking a look, this time in Jeremiah chapter 33, and we'll read from verse 16, or begin at verse 16. In those days Judah shall be saved, and Jerusalem shall dwell safely. Hardly true in Jesus' time. For thus says the Eternal, David shall never want a man to sit upon the throne of the house of Israel. If you can break my covenant with day, my covenant with night, alluding back to the symbols of the sun and the moon, that there should not be day or night in their season, then may also my covenant be broken with David my servant, and he should not have a son reign upon his throne, and with the Levites the priests my ministers. As the host of the heaven cannot be numbered, neither the sand of the sea measured, so will I multiply the seed of David my servant, and the Levites that minister unto me. If my covenant be not with day or night, and if I have not appointed the ordinances unto heaven and earth, then I will cast away the seed of Jacob, and David my servant, so that I will not take any of his seed to be rulers, plural, not ruler, singular, over the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For I will cause their captivity to return, and I will have mercy upon them. Again, a sampling of passages, and I've given you in the reading material for Unit 6, others that could go along with that. What we do know, and the contours again to elaborate somewhat on the tradition and give a few more details. Jeremiah chapter 52. Zedekiah, the last king of the line of David to rule over the Jewish people. In verse 11, we read of his unfortunate demise. Then he, Nebuchadnezzar, put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and the king of Babylon bound him in chains, and he carried him to Babylon and put him in prison until the day of his death. No offshoot out of the line of David, the Pharez lineage, which provided kings for Judah from David's time up until the early 6th century. None of those rulers ever rose up to seize control. The closest perhaps would have been Zerubbabel, who actually was a Pharez Jew, but descended not directly even from Zedekiah. Now the Jeremiah tradition suggests these broad outlines and contours, that in around 585 BC or thereabouts, after Jeremiah was released by his Babylonian captors, he left Jerusalem and went to Egypt. This much is provided from the biblical account. Jeremiah chapter 43. As the remnant left behind spared the captivity into Babylon, which most of Israel endured and experienced, Jeremiah was left behind with the king's daughters and with a host of others. Verse 1 of chapter 43, it came to pass when Jeremiah had made an end of speaking all the words, speaking to all the people the words of the eternal their God, for which the eternal their God had sent him to them, even all these words. Then spoke Azariah. He went on, he and all these proud men, saying to Jeremiah, you speak falsely. The eternal our God has not sent you to say, don't go into Egypt and sojourn there. The aristocracy, the leadership that was left behind, wanted to flee to Egypt, lest the Babylonians change their mind and come back and impose upon them an even greater captivity. Baruch, Jeremiah's secretary, set you on against us, for to deliver us into the hands of the Chaldeans or Babylonians, that they might put us to death and take us, like the others, away captives into Babylon. Dropping down to verse 6, even men and women and children and the king's daughters and every person that Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, had left with Gedaliah, all of these were there, and ultimately through force of circumstance, through a rebellion, through resisting Jeremiah's counsel not to go to Egypt, Jeremiah, the king's daughters, and the entire party eventually moved and went in that direction. It's at that point that we lose track from the biblical and secular historical record of what happened to the prophet Jeremiah. Legend implies that Jeremiah, around 580 BC, traveled to Spain. After some difficulties and encounters there, eventually he went around through the Atlantic Ocean, up through the area of the British Isles, and eventually set in at a place called Carrickfergus, which is adjacent to Belfast, Ireland today. There's a lovely little port. It's the place where many different people historically have landed, creating significant events in the history, and at least according to legend and tradition, Carrickfergus is where Jeremiah set foot there. Coming with him, as we've already seen, were the daughters of Zedekiah. Her marriage to Herman, the ruler of that Jewish colony, which had been there for almost half a millennium, would bring, in a sense, a kind of closure to that breach, healing the breach between Zerah and the Pharez line. Now, the biblical evidence in these two passages that I'm about to provide for you, once again, is subject to interpretation. Let's go back to Jeremiah and look in chapter 1. There are different ways to understand these verses. In Jeremiah chapter 1 and verse 9, Jeremiah says, Then the Eternal put forth his hand, he touched my mouth. The Eternal said unto me, I have put my words in your mouth. Verse 10, See, I have this day set you over nations and over kingdoms, to root out, to pull down, to destroy, to throw down, to build, and to plant. And in this passage, many in the British Israelite community have taken have read a prophecy of the rooting out of the throne of David from Jerusalem, the transplanting of that throne in Ireland, which would again be subsequently uprooted, moved from Ireland to Scotland, and finally again uprooted and transplanted where, as the argument goes, it resides today in the British Isles. Now another prophet, Ezekiel, whereas Jeremiah's commission recorded here in Jeremiah chapter 1, I think may hold a little more weight. Another passage that I'll draw your attention to, and again, it's subject to interpretation. There are, personally, I believe, good arguments to be very cautious about applying this in the way that typically the British Israelites have done. Ezekiel 21, beginning in verse 25. And you, profane, wicked prince of Israel, whose day is come, when iniquity shall end, thus says the eternal God, remove the diadem and take off the crown. This shall be the same. Exalt him that is low and abase him that is high, in reference to the Pharez-Zerah dispute. I will overturn it. And as I've said, the British Israelite exponents through the years have oftentimes applied this verse, the three overturns, to the location of Ireland, Scotland, and London in terms of where the throne has been placed. Another and perhaps more probable, although possibly complementary explanation to that particular point of view would be the language here is a repetition for the sake of emphasis, implying the dramatic, powerful, overwhelming military force which was going to destroy the kingdom of Judah. I will overturn it, and it shall be no more until he comes whose right it is, and I will give it to him. The implication there being, of course, messianic and pointing to Jesus Christ and what he would do in terms of the restoration, if you will, of that throne. Now, in the time remaining, what I would like to do is to move with dispatch through another thread which is oftentimes identified with this business about the throne of David. The argument is that when Jeremiah left, and if you'll turn in your Bible to Genesis chapter 28, when Jeremiah left Jerusalem, he took with him various relics. Some would argue that the Ark of the Covenant was part of what he brought along with him. I don't know whether that's the case or not. But some would say that with him was a very special stone. The stone spoken of here in Genesis 28 and verses 11 and 18. Jacob, on his travels back to his homeland where he would eventually marry Leah and Rachel and build his nuclear family, it says that on these travels he lighted upon a certain place. He tarried there all night because the sun had gone down. And he took the stones of that place and put them there for his pillows. And he lay down in that place to sleep. And then in verse 18, and Jacob rose up early in the morning. He took the stone which he had put for his pillows, and he set it up for a pillow, and he poured oil upon it. And according to one tradition, that stone was eventually retrieved and carried as part of the relics that were among the children of Israel, as part of what they had in terms of symbolizing their special relationship with God and so on and so forth. Now the tradition has that stone going with Jeremiah all the way to Ireland. Eventually it was placed in a place where the royal families of Ireland typically assembled. If you ever have a chance to visit in southern Ireland, Tara exists today, and the ruins there are quite magnificent. Some would argue that some of those mounds hold the bones of Tia Tephi and Harriman and various other ones who play a role in the legend of the reunion of the Zerah and Pharez lines. According to tradition, the stone remained there at Tara up until around 530 A.D., at which time Fergus MacEirc, one of the rulers, transported that stone to the little Scottish island off the western Scottish coast, a place called Ionia, and it remained again there for about 300 years. Then in A.D. 843, the monarch Kevin MacAlpin, according to the story, took the stone with him when he moved into the Scottish mainland. He had consolidated his rule over the Picts and various other people in that region, and McAlpin moved it to where it was found for another extended period of time, around 400 years, at a place called Scone or Scone. Oftentimes we hear the Stone of Scone referred to, and that's over in eastern Scotland, in the lowlands, not too far from the modern-day city of Perth. Allegedly, that stone was used in the coronation of various kings of Scotland for the next 4 centuries. And today there's even a little monument, and you can go and have your picture made where allegedly these coronations took place. Then going back to Mel Gibson Braveheart fame again, in 1296, a very imperialist-minded English king, Edward Longshanks, or Edward I, who ruled from 1272 to 1307, and who gave the Scots fits during much of his reign. Longshanks went to Scotland, took with him that stone. It was almost a kind of in-your-face kind of an action. He had it brought back, placed in Westminster Abbey, where it formed part of Edward the Confessor's chair and was used in English coronation ceremonies, but all but just a handful of every English monarch from Edward I's time right up until Elizabeth II. The pictures of that throne and the coronation chair and the stone lodged beneath or at the base of the throne appear in many, many of the works that are published on the identity of Israel in modern times. Now, if the notion of this Davidic English monarch is valid, however, it was not until 1603 that an actual descendant from the family of David became king and ruler of England. That occurred, and we'll talk more in part 2 about this individual and events surrounding these particular movements and developments. James VI, the King of Scotland, when Queen Elizabeth I died in 1603, became the heir designated by Elizabeth, and he moved down to London and took his seat as King James I of England. Now, in the 1950s, the Scots actually, in a dramatic rescue attempt, stole the stone, and for a period of time, the stone was held captive by the Scots. Eventually, it was returned, but here recently, I believe actually in 1996, the throne was finally given back to the Scots. Now, for those who have an interest in these kinds of things, let me give you 2 references. One will be favorable, the other will not be quite so favorable, or at least it will raise the possibility of some problems. But I think we need to be academically honest and forthright here, taking on the challenges head on. Probably the best documentation, at least that I've seen, of the Davidic lineage coming from David and extending all the way down through the ruling English house today was done by a man whose name was W.M.H. Milner. The book he wrote was The Royal House of Britain, An Enduring Dynasty. And if you get a chance to examine that volume, you'll find, with significant gaps to be sure, but you will find documentation then of the movements of that throne in terms of the lineage. Now, the problem comes in with some recent research and scholarship. There were a couple of Englishmen. One was named Malcolm and the other William Potts. They're brothers. Malcolm is an embryologist at the University of California at Berkeley. William is a zoologist at Lancaster University in the British Isles. But they came out a couple of years ago with a book called Queen Victoria's Gene, Hemophilia and the Royal Family. And what they have done is they've called into question Victoria's lineage based on the fact that hemophilia has been transmitted down the line through her or in her offspring. They've suggested, in fact, that Victoria may well have been the product of an illicit union between her mother and someone other than her supposed father, the Duke of Kent. Hemophilia, which is found among her descendants, did not come from her consort, her husband, Prince Albert, and it did not exhibit itself in any of Victoria's forerunners. Perhaps it was a spontaneous mutation. That could happen. But if it was, it's a 1 in 50,000 chance of developing in that way. The answer, indeed, probably could be found by exhuming Queen Victoria's body for scientific analysis, but the royal family and protocol being what it is today, probably that will not take place. Well, that brings us to closure then for this lecture, the second one in Unit 6. We'll come back next time and take up the issue of tribal identities.